Good evening, students. Welcome back to Mr. Wilson's lectures. This evening we will be discussing Indian removal under President Jackson and the Trail of Tears. Use the lecture information to answer the following three questions. First off, do you agree with the policy of Indian removal? Why or why not? If yes, tell me and explain to me why was it justified, and if no, what other options could the government have used? Secondly, was the Removal Act within the powers of the president? And lastly, should Andrew Jackson have been impeached for defying the Supreme Court? Please explain each answer with evidence from the lecture. Thank you very much, and we'll see you tomorrow. Today we will be discussing the Indian Removal Act and the subsequent Trail of Tears. American and Native American relations were fraught from the beginning, but as the 19th century marched on, we saw America continue to push west and take Native American lands. Most whites just wanted them to move. However, the United States government came up with an idea, and that was to civilize the Native American tribes, essentially having them become European. And hopefully from this, they would sell their land after they went into debt. Five civilized tribes of the Southeast were the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Seminole. While he may not look like a Native American tribe, the man in the picture is Elias Boudinot, one of the chiefs of the Cherokee Nation. Now, Andrew Jackson was no fan of Native Americans, and he was not a big proponent of the idea of civilization. His idea was for removal. He felt that Indians should be pushed west of the Mississippi River, where they could live in peace by themselves and would not come into contact with white settlers anymore. Congress decided to establish Indian Territory in modern-day Oklahoma, where Native Americans could settle, live in their traditional ways, and have a homeland that would be forever off limits to white settlement. Also, the United States government created the Bureau of Indian Affairs to deal with all Native American issues. Now, the idea that the United States government would give any land to Native Americans was rather troubling, for the fact of previous policy was to take as much land as possible and use it for white settlement. So from this, we can infer that the land that they would be given was absolutely horrible, as generally speaking, the land that they received in Oklahoma was. Although the five civilized tribes had in fact civilized, they were still facing constant pressure from white settlements, especially after gold was discovered in Georgia. This placed increasing pressure on the civilized tribes to move to the new Indian Territory in Oklahoma. Jackson saw removal as an opportunity to meet the needs of the white farmers. He also felt that it was in the best interest of the Indians, and he in fact felt that he was doing the Indians a favor by granting them territory that would remain forever theirs. Indians would be moved from Georgia, North Carolina, Arkansas, Mississippi, and even up in Illinois and Wisconsin. Jackson thought of himself as sort of a grandfather to the Americas and especially to the Native Americans. And he is quoted as saying, "Where you are now, you and my white children are too near to each other to live in harmony. Your game is gone. Many of your people will not work and till the earth. The land beyond the Mississippi belongs to the president and no one else. He will give it to you forever." What he fails to say in this particular passage is that the land beyond the Mississippi is relatively untillable, and they are leaving some of the finest farmland in the Americas for some of the worst. According to Vice President John C. Calhoun, one of the greatest evils in which they, Native Americans, are subject is the incessant, constant pressure of our population, essentially saying that there can be no peace as the white population of the Americas grows. Now, according to John C. Calhoun, why is the United States government forcing the Native Americans to move off of their homeland? It's simple. White people want it. What is wrong with this statement? Well, essentially saying that we are causing them evil, but we don't necessarily care because the land to us is too valuable and we must take it, regardless if they have generations and centuries of roots on that land. Now, who were the Native American tribes that were set to be moved? The most prominent of all of them were the Cherokee. Now, the Cherokee were essentially civilized. They lived peacefully in the Appalachian Mountains of Georgia and Tennessee. They adopted white culture. They spoke English. They created their own Cherokee alphabet. They had their own Cherokee newspaper and printing press. Most Cherokee chiefs wore European clothing. And in fact, they many a times had represented themselves in a European or in American courts to get their way, based on their government, on the United States Constitution, and did everything possible to live the ways of the United States. Now, the one thing that we know about Andrew Jackson is that he was a hard-headed man. And once he made up his mind to make a decision, well, it stuck. So, even though the Cherokee sued the government of Georgia for taking their land in Worcester versus Georgia, and this court case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court upon appeal, the Supreme Court rules in the Cherokee's favor, and they say that the Cherokee can stay. At the moment, the Cherokee made a huge, huge decision for them, and they expect them to be able to stay on their land indefinitely. Andrew Jackson, on the other hand, had other ideas, and in fact, he said removal would go on as scheduled, and it doesn't matter what the Supreme Court says, we are not stopping it. And he's famously quoted by saying, Chief Justice John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. Essentially daring the Chief Justice to come and thwart the president. Now we know Andrew Jackson, even in his later years, was not a man to be trifled with. Now, what is the job of the Supreme Court? Is to interpret the laws of the nation to make sure that they are faithful to the United States Constitution. The job of the president is to execute those laws. If the Supreme Court says something, the president needs to execute those laws. What should happen if a government official does not follow the laws of the Supreme Court? Well, I leave it to you to answer that question. After the court case of Worcester versus Georgia failed to win a stay for the Native Americans, many Native Americans up and moved peacefully to Oklahoma by themselves. However, upwards of 18,000 stayed on their ancestral homelands, refusing to move. As the winter drew near in 1838, United States military forces came into Cherokee homelands, rounded up the remaining Cherokee, put them into camps, and then force-marched them the 1,000 miles from western Georgia to Oklahoma. During this march, where they were not given adequate food nor adequate clothing, upwards of 25% of the Cherokee died. Mostly the dead were elderly and children, ones that were not physically fit to make the march. However, this was a clear and abhorrent case of a miscarriage of justice, where the United States Army was used to essentially massacre thousands of Native Americans. This famous painting demonstrates the sorrow and the suffering that the Native Americans had on the Trail of Tears. However, it even glosses over a lot of the suffering as we see many of the people riding on horses and or donkeys, most of them walked during this 1,000-mile journey. Now that we have discussed the Indian removal and Trail of Tears, I want you to answer once again these three questions using specific evidence from the lecture. First off, do you agree with the policy of Indian removal? Why or why not? If yes, why was it justified? And if no, what other options could the United States government had? Was the removal act within the power of the President of the United States? And lastly, should Andrew Jackson have been impeached after defying the Supreme Court? Be ready to discuss these questions tomorrow in class. Thank you for listening.